Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending this month's webinar presented by Dr. Ellen Deutsch. Today's webinar is titled Measuring the Impact of Simulation, an Introduction to Run and Control Charts. I'm Ann Ades, a member of the IPSS Board of Directors and a member of the Education Committee. For those of you who are not IPSS members, please consider joining the Society as we offer many benefits, including exclusive access to this recorded webinar and presentation after today's live session. Please visit our website to see the benefits of membership. A few quick housekeeping notes before we get to today's presentation. Please feel free to post questions during the session. In the upper right side of your computer screen, you will see a control panel. In the lower portion of that panel, you can type in a question or comment and submit it to the webinar organizers. You can do this at any time during the presentation. And also feel free when we have specific times where we might ask for questions to come on audio and ask your question. You can use the raise hand function to let us know that you have a question also. And we will reserve about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for Q&A. As I mentioned, Ellen will be talking about measuring the impact of simulation, an introduction to run and control charts. Dr. Deutsch practiced as a pediatric otolaryngologist for 20 years before taking a full-time position in simulation and completing a master's degree in healthcare, quality, and patient safety. She has served in leadership roles in national otolaryngology and international simulation organizations. And she currently serves as a senior scientist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and an adjunct associate professor at the University of Pennsylvania, Perelman School of Medicine. Her expertise includes patient safety data analysis and display, and her goals include implementing human factors principles and enhancing the resilience of healthcare delivery systems, thereby empowering clinicians to improve patient safety and provider and patient satisfaction. Ellen, it's off to you now.
Okay, thank you. I'm hoping you can hear me. This is a challenging topic, so I will do my best. It's also challenging for us in simulation to demonstrate the impact of what we do, of our interventions, in a rigorous manner. I'm going to start with a few disclosures. One is I'm a learner too. I know something about run charts and control charts, but there's plenty more to learn. I have no relevant disclosures. I do use a commercial statistical process control chart software, but I'm not advocating for any specific product or company. We do believe that simulation can improve learners and systems, but it can be very hard to quantify that. The traditional method in healthcare is randomized controlled trials and studies like that, but we don't have that option in simulation. We can't necessarily randomize the simulation interventions. Often simulation is embedded into ongoing quality improvement processes. So again, it challenges our ability to demonstrate that we've made a difference. So how can we tackle this to demonstrate our value? And I think we can borrow and adapt some of the techniques that are used in quality improvement science. And that can help us determine whether interventions are associated with changes in processes or outcomes. So we're going to talk about graphical displays of data over time, specifically run charts and control charts. Control charts are also called Shewhart charts or statistical process control charts. And their interpretation is based on theories of probability. So it's not easy to make this a very sexy presentation, but I'm going to try to make it simple and digestible. My goals today are to provide an introduction that will help you read basic control charts. I'd like to highlight some of the important concepts that will help you understand control charts. And at the end, I'm going to provide what I hope will be a useful take-home summary for you. There's also a list of resources that I've used Usually when I put together a presentation, I like to credit, if it came from an article or an expert, I like to give them credit right on the slide. But in this case, it's sort of all mixed together, and so I just lumped all the acknowledgements at the end. I also want to make sure that you realize that all the examples that I'm going to present in this presentation are hypothetical. None of them are real, but they are designed to illustrate specific principles. So we'll start with run charts. You've probably seen lots of these. They have some great advantages. They provide a running record of a process over time, and that's going to be a theme in run charts and control charts. The x-axis is time. The display is dynamic, and they're very easily understood. They're very useful at the beginning of a process because they only require about 10 data points. And I'm sure you've seen control charts for things like percent of people who wash their hands correctly, or patients who get pre-op antibiotics in a timely manner. We could do run charts about the number of patients with COVID, or the number of patients who've had COVID testing, or the percentage of OR rooms that start on time. I mean, there's really no limit. In this case, the y-axis is percentage, but it could also be a number. It's just a scale. And then again, on the bottom, on the x-axis, we're looking at time. So here's another example. And what I did was I made a chart of the number of simulations from a hypothetical simulation center. And what happened in the 2nd January is we added some staff, and so we were able to perform more simulations. So it's pretty easy to tell on the run chart that we've improved the total number of simulations that we're accomplishing per month. There are some rules for interpreting run charts, but I'm not going to get into the details of that, because if we can understand statistical process control charts, then you can also understand run charts. So because statistical process control charts have a lot more components to them. So we'll focus on the control charts, but understand that there are rules you can apply to run charts also. Another thing about the axes is this timeline can be any unit, right? I mean, in this example, I've used months, but it could be days, it could be weeks, it could be years, it could be hours, I mean, it could be any unit, and it could be anything sequential. So it could be number of, number of simulations to be confusing in this example, but it could be simulation 1, simulation 2, etc. So what I've done with the software is I've added a point where we made the process change. And this run chart has a center line, which is the mean, the average. And when I told the computer that we had made a change here, it recalibrated and recalculated the average for the series. So one of the really foundational concepts about control charts is that they can help us understand the difference between common cause variation and special cause variation. So common cause variation are those things that happen all the time. In this case, we're going to talk about driving to work. So if you drive to work, your driving time may be 34 minutes on Monday, 32 minutes on Tuesday. There's going to be some inherent variability in this process. And what the control charts will tell us is how much of that variability is expected, or are there events or changes that suggest that there's something going on beyond common cause variation, and that would be special cause variation. So special cause variation might be something like you're driving to work and the road is blocked, or there's an accident on the highway and the traffic is stopped. It could be an interruption or a change in the process. And it's not necessarily good or bad, because sometimes that special cause variation is an improvement, and sometimes that special cause variation is an indication that there's a problem or something isn't functioning the way it should. But so it's value agnostic, but the idea is that we want to not be distracted by the little variations that happen all the time and that are inevitable. And we want to be able to identify when there's an important variation to either fix it if it's something we don't want, or to see if we can implement it more permanently if it happens to be an improvement. So in this particular example, in the last week, it looks like we've gotten to work earlier than our usual. So maybe something has happened, and we want to figure out if that's truly the case. I mean, maybe we're getting to work early enough that we get that coveted parking space. So the same data on the left, and what we've done is we've again plotted our driving time on a run chart, and you can see that sure enough, the time to work is decreased significantly in the last week. Well, I don't want to not using the word significantly in a formal sense, but we're pleased that we're getting to work earlier, or maybe sleeping in a few minutes later. Could be before COVID and after COVID. There, you'll notice the scale here doesn't go to 0, and I know a lot of people feel like if your scale doesn't go to 0, it's deceptive. This software doesn't make the scale go to 0, but you can override it and force it to go to 0 if you're looking to have, you know, that if it's important to you to have the 0 quantity in your axis, and of course, there are times where that is reasonable, but you can overwrite the software if you wish to do that. So let's move on to the statistical process control charts. And everybody knows this is the sort of the crude representation of a normal curve. And I'm going to explain this in a kind of simplistic manner, but bear with me, because I think you'll get the point, even though you'll understand that it's actually a little more complicated. So we have a normal curve, and if we take that and turn it on its side, there we go, and stretch it out, then we still have this valuable information. We have the timeline on the bottom. If we're going to use this as a control chart, we have the timeline on the bottom, and we have some measure on the y-axis. So the time, as I said, could be any unit. It could be hours or days or weeks, but it also could be simulation number 1, simulation number 2, simulation number 3. And despite the similarity to you know, a normal curve, there are some differences with control charts. So the control chart has an upper control limit and a lower control limit, and these are designated as sigma. This is actually where the 6 sigma comes from, plus or minus 3 sigma. So the sigma is an estimate of the variability of a process. It's not exactly the same thing as a standard deviation. This, we talk in terms of upper control limits and lower control limits, not in terms of distribution of data. And you can see there are zones. So we're going to shrink this down so it's a little more manageable. And again, we have time, which only goes from left to right, and we have measures, which can have a little more variety. And again, just to reinforce, the upper control limit and the lower control limit describe the variability of a process. not confidence limits, which describe the variability of a distribution of data. So I'm going to take away that standard curve, and now we have our control chart. So recall that we expect there'll be some normal variation in a process, and I've just crudely drawn a bunch of dots. So, you know, the first simulation, we got this, whatever this is, percent correct or whatever it is, we got this. The second simulation, we got this, etc. You get it. And what we want to, we know that there will be some variation that's normal, but what we want to be able to do is identify where there's special cause variation, because again, that could be something bad that we want to mitigate, or could be something good that we want to reinforce and continue. So there are a lot of rules, and I would suggest that you not memorize the rules, because you can either use software to identify them for you, or you can look them up. But I think what you'll see in the next few examples are some patterns that are pretty identifiable. So in this case, we have one data point that's outside of our control limits. So we would expect that more than 99% of the data should be within the control limits. So this tells you that there's some special cause variation happening here. You don't know what it is necessarily, but this is when it happened. So maybe you can go back and figure out from that event what it was. So this is one of the patterns that tells you there's special cause variation, as opposed to, you know, you've all been in situations like maybe you're here and then you see this drop down a little bit, and this drop down, and then this drop down, and you think, oh my gosh, we have a terrible trend downward, or maybe it's a good trend downward, but you're not sure if it's actually has importance, and that's what these patterns tell you, that this data point, it has importance. It suggests special cause variation. Here's another pattern. In this case, there's more than 8 points on one side of the center line. That suggests special cause variation also. Something unusual is going on here. Here's another one. In this case, we have 7 or more points all heading downward, or they could all be heading upward, but 7 or more points in a row like that suggest special cause variation. And then this one is the sawtooth pattern, where the points zigzag around the center line, and again, that suggests special cause variation. And I always find this a little confusing, because you'd think that would be desirable, but it statistically doesn't make sense, or suggests that the distribution isn't as we would expect it. And then there's one other pattern. Again, I wouldn't memorize the patterns, but just think about the concepts. And this one suggests special cause variation because there are too many points in the extreme zones, in, you know, the zone B or in zone C. So maybe I'll stop here for a moment and see if there are any questions, because the special cause variation versus common cause variation is really critical to understanding control charts. And I don't know if any questions have shown up in the chat, or I'll wait for a moment, and if not, I'll keep going. Okay, I'll keep going. Next, the data that we look at could be continuous or variable, so maybe how long something takes, the time it takes to accomplish something, the time between something, and things like weights and scores and ages are all continuous variables. Then there are discrete variables, also called attributes. These are counts of things, or rates that are derived from counts. things like the number of patient falls or the number of COVID patients. Could be percent of participants in your simulation who performed very well, the percent of participants in your simulation who used closed loop communication, whatever. So that's data. There's two more really important concepts, and these are kind of unique to the control charts. One is the idea of defects and defectives. So for discrete data like counts, you can have defects, meaning that a classic example is patients falling. One patient can fall more than one time. Or if you're administering, if there's a process of giving a medication to a patient, there are multiple points along that process where a defect could happen. And maybe in your simulation, you're teaching people how to do a bundle of tasks, like they want to do central line dressing changes. So there are multiple potential defects in that process. The other kind of data is defective. So defective means that the whole thing is good or bad. Obviously, defective implies bad, but it's sort of the all or none concept. So for the classic defective is that the patient dies because they can only die once. But you can also look at it as non-conforming. So it could be something that's not bad, but that's actually good. So one way we could use that is you're teaching people how to do a bundle of tasks and they do all of them correctly. So then they have accomplished a non-conforming data point. So that's it's a little the wording comes from when Schuhart created these like 100 years ago, and it was really based on manufacturing and, you know, at what point do you stop the line because the process isn't working right. So the word defective has a negative connotation, but it can also be that something was done 100% correctly or successfully completed. So the other thing that we think about in the control charts is sample size, and this can be constant or it can be variable. In simulations, you might have people learning to don and doff, and you could, if they contaminate themselves, they may contaminate themselves multiple times. Those would be defects. Or they may, or you may say that any contamination makes the whole process defective. You can define it how you want, but I think I'm hoping you get the idea. And the other side of it, the other way to look at it is if they did everything correctly, then they have a non-conforming process. So, okay, it's pretty dense. We are going to get to some control charts to look at them. The other thing is there are a zillion types of control charts, but there are really only a few really basic ones. And this is, I would consider this an introduction. So, you know, just like in statistics, there's always something more complicated you can do. There's always something more complicated you can do. And especially if you have unusual data sets, very large data sets, very rare events, there are reasons to use more exotic control charts. But, and there are some subtleties, but really basically you want to know in counted data, are there defects, or are you looking at the defectives? And are you looking at a sample size that doesn't vary, or are you looking at a sample size that does vary? And then when we look at variable data, we want to, there's a different kind of a chart with a moving range, and I'll show you an example of that. So here's an example that I made up. And in this case, We have participants. We have our timeline is day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and every day we have a certain number of participants. It varies though, so our sample size varies. We have 90 participants some days, 75 other days. We can look at their successes. There's a bundle of things to do. Maybe they are doing central line dressing changes. Maybe they're learning robotic surgery. Maybe they're donning and doffing PPE. Whatever it is, we can look at successes and we can look at breaches. So one person could have more than one breach. That person would not be successful, but here we have 5 people who weren't successful, but 7 breaches. I hope that's clear. So our question is, are simulations effective? And to figure that out, what control chart should we use? And I'm thanking Sandra Amin because I thought her article, which is in the references at the end, is like the best introduction, and she's very generous. She says that in reality, sometimes more than one control chart can be appropriate. But she also says that the way you decide what control chart you're going to use is by examining an element. So if we want to look at breaches, for instance, we have to decide, are breaches a defect or a defective? And breaches are a defect because you can have more than one breach per participant. So I ran that control chart and I used software for that, just a zillion times easier, and it gives you nice things like it changes the symbols and the color when something represents special cause variation. You can see here our bottom line, our lower control limit is 0, can't get lower than that for this condition, but our upper control limit varies, and it varies based on the number of participants in that sample. So I just put this chart here as reference because it's very hard to remember these things. So I've repeated this little chart a couple of times just as a reference. But what matters for this is we ended up with a U chart because we're looking at defects with a variable sample size. And I hope this is clear, but this is common cause variation. This is the variability that would be expected, and then something happened here. And maybe we changed our technique. Maybe we changed the resources that we used. Maybe we learned a better way to do something, but something changed here. Here's another way. So what I've done here, the software is lovely because the software, I could tell the software, and here's where we changed our process. And so it could recalibrate our upper control limit going forward. And we do want to have, usually you want to have tighter and tighter control limits. So the other thing we can look at in this same data set was, rather than look at how many breaches there were, we can look at how many participants successfully completed the task. And in this case, we're looking at defective, even though that's kind of backwards, because actually we're looking at success or non-conforming. And again, we had a variable sample size. So in that case, we wanted a P chart, which is what the computer, I told the computer to give me a P chart, but the program also has what it calls a wizard. And sometimes I use the wizard to double check myself. And sometimes no matter what chart you choose, you come up with a very similar pattern. So I don't quite understand it, but it kind of reinforces it. So in any event, in this case, we had random cause variation, common cause variation in the beginning of the process. But again, at this point, at about day 14, something happened and our participants started to do better. So again, the direction of up or down is really relevant to what you're looking at, of course, because for some things you want more success, and for some things you want less, fewer errors. But the idea is that the computer program tagged that these were special cause variation. And here our upper control limit is flat because it's 100. It's 1%, 100%, but down here our lower control limit is variable. So again, I could tell the program that here's where we made a process change, and then it recalibrates our central line of our expectations going forward. So here's another hypothetical control chart. We want to decrease OR turnover time. So we conduct a bunch of simulations, and after simulation 13, we collected all the suggestions for improvement. And maybe it turned out that the resources that were needed to set up the OR were in different places, or maybe there was a delay in getting the patients ready in the PACU, or whatever it was. We took the suggestions that we developed during the debriefings of the simulations, and we tried to implement them at simulation 14. And that's why I made it a slightly different color, because we changed our process. So now the question is, did we make a difference? And we think we did, because these numbers kind of look lower than the numbers before our process change. And we do want the numbers to go down, because they're minutes, turnover minutes, we want to decrease them. So we run a control chart. Now this is a continuous variable. So it shows that we have common cause variation until we get to about 14. And then we have something unusual going on. And that is when we implemented our process changes. And this is the second half of the continuous variable chart. And this is sort of the stability of the first chart. So the changes here are proportional to the changes here. So for instance, you'll notice there's no 1, because it can't measure that change until there's a second data point in the X chart. Here we have the greatest difference between the minutes in simulation 13 and the minutes in simulation 14, which you can see here. So this shows up as being supporting our idea that we had special cause variation. And then it looks like maybe we're stabilizing. So this is an X chart or an XMR chart for continuous variables. What I can do with the software also is tell it, we made this change at point 14, and it can recalibrate our upper control limit, our lower control limit, and our center line. So we can go back to our original process that we looked at, which was our driving time. And we had originally done a run chart, but now let's look at a control chart. And the control chart says, yeah, there was a blip here on that Tuesday, the second Tuesday. We could think about what that is. I'm not completely sure why it's highlighted, but I do understand why this is highlighted, and it suggests that it's more than just common cause variation, that the likelihood of this being ordinary variation, that it's unlikely to be ordinary variation and very likely to be something that happened. And there's also the accompanying moving range chart, which also shows that there was something kind of distinct that happened that last week, and then it kind of stabilized. So I have put that's the end of that content with one exception. I've put the resources and acknowledgements here because I didn't want to miss them. Again, this is a great article by Sandra Amin. And also the IHI website has some whiteboard lectures that are, 5 or 8 minutes long that do a great job of explaining this. And there's some other resources and articles that I have found helpful. And this is getting to the end. I just want to repeat the really basic concepts that I think underpin process control charts. They demonstrate process stability, and the function is to distinguish common cause versus special cause variation. And that's the huge underlying purpose. The averages and the sigma lines, and the sigma lines are estimates, are calculated from the data that you enter. More than 99% of the data should fall between the upper control limit and the lower control limit, which is plus or minus 3 sigma. And you've seen there are some patterns of data that should alert you that there's special cause variation, but there are different parameters. And so the best thing to do is actually use a reference to either use software or a reference to determine the importance of that. And then finally, there are a variety of control charts, and the one you select depends on the data that you're analyzing. So you have to decide if you're looking at defects versus defectives, whether your sample size is the same or variable, and what kind of data you are entering into the chart. So that's the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to do my best to answer questions. Although I do have to figure out how to see that, but Anne will help me.
Great, thanks, Ellen. That was a great presentation on what was more complicated than I ever imagined that control and run charts were.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, because I was really trying to make the underlying concepts simple, although I kind of think of it like statistics, where there's always something else you can refine. There's always more to refine, but at least I think, you'll have a workable, I hope you'll have a workable knowledge, so you can at least look at a run chart and understand what it's telling you.
No, I think definitely. I didn't realize there were so many different types. That was great to learn. I thought there's just one basic one. I don't see any questions right now. Travis says that was fantastic and super helpful. Thanks, Ellen. We'll give some people time to kind of think about it.
I think we can also unmute because sometimes it's easier to ask a question rather than type it in. I think that's possible.
So maybe I'm curious, is anyone using these types of ways to kind of look at our data and the way we're using our simulations? Is anyone taking a kind of this quality improvement lens? Anyone on the call that wants to chime in, or Ellen, if you know of anything specific?
I'm not sure. And I would love to hear from anyone on the call, but I just want to say that oftentimes administrators are using certainly run charts, but also control charts, and so it kind of speaks their language. So if you're trying to justify something to administration, these data displays are familiar to them. I don't know that they can all create them, but I think they can read them, and so you're sort of speaking their language, which could be useful. I've also struggled with how do you prove that something makes a difference if it evolves as you go, which is really typical of a lot of like PDSA cycles and simulation interventions, where you debrief, you find something to change, and you try to change it right away instead of waiting till you've accumulated 10 or 20 or 30 of it. And so this lets you look at data over time in a way that has validity, that I think is useful.
I agree.
Are there particular softwares that are easier to use for those of us who are brand new at this and interested to jump in and try using some of this for our sim work? And I'm not trying to get anybody in trouble with brand names. I literally know nothing about even where to start for like which programs or software to play with this stuff.
So I use a software that was recommended to me, so I can't tell you that I've sampled them all. I use QI Macro. They have tutorials. They have information that pops up as you go to make your selections. I've found it user-friendly, and it's in, for an individual license, it's in the $250-ish range. Don't quote me on that exactly, but not cheap, but not outrageous.
That's super helpful. Thank you. I love the examples that you went through showing us how for different kinds of projects that we're doing, we could use these different charts to better represent, or in a different way to represent what we're doing. I am very eager to try this. We don't do this at all yet. At least I don't. I'm sure other people at my institution maybe. But our new quality chair is much more interested and supportive of simulation than anybody in that kind of role has been up until now. So learning how to speak his language, as I think I heard you guys say, is something that is really important, and this made it very accessible and seemed like something I can maybe even figure out how to do in a reasonable time frame.
Yeah, so one of our challenges is that run chart, you can start with maybe 10 data points. Control chart, you may want 12 to 20 data points to start with. And if you're looking at weeks or months, that's an awful long time. But if you do it in terms of simulations, you may be able to get there a lot quicker. So I think we should make it as flexible as we can.
Yeah, I could also imagine we could use some of this even to look at our, not just our simulation efficiency in terms of the outcome of the simulation, but how our programs run and how long, like we want to evaluate how long does it take to set up, and are there things that we need to do to set up or to kind of minimize the amount of traffic time or work time, to look at it from that perspective and just from a more of a global perspective of how our simulations work, and try and use a QI to evaluate that could be interesting.
That's really interesting, because you could look at, what's the average setup time. You could look at setup time by type of simulation or by facilitator, or a whole variety of things. And maybe you find that the setup time for certain simulations is longer, but then you look at it and you say, well, all those are the ones where we had to drag the equipment, over the river and through the woods to get it to the in situ location. And so, yeah, I think there are creative ways that you could use this for managing your simulations, as well as for evaluating the impact of your simulation on clinical processes.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason I went through all the kinds of control charts is just because if you're having a discussion with someone about them, you don't want to be uninformed. my meager approach to statistics is it's really hard for me to know what statistic to choose, but if an expert chooses the statistic, I can kind of understand what it's telling me, and that's what I'm hoping. That's about where I am at run charts too, at control charts also. I have to pick through them very laboriously to make sure I'm choosing the right one, but I've been somewhat reassured that I can pick different ones, or as Sandra Amin said, there could be more than one that's actually appropriate, and they often come out with identical results. So don't be intimidated by that, and also that's why I put all those little charts in the handout, so you have them for reference, and they're in the articles also.
Any other comments or questions from other people on the webinar?
Maybe people can get back an extra 15 minutes.
Oh, hi, Ellen. I had a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, come on.
So in that OR sample, were these participants different each day, or there were some same ones or in some different ones? How do you account for like the mix?
I just made that up. So you, as a hypothetical example, so you could do it however you want to. If you're following one participant over time, you could track if their accomplishment of a process gets better. What I did was I said we changed how we taught them, and so they learned better because we changed our curriculum. That was the hypothetical rationale. But you could use this for an individual and track their number of success, their defects or their defectives over time, depending on what you're looking at.
Yeah, that seems easier to do if you are tracking individuals, but they all have to show up. So a lot of time in clinical practice, it seems like, it would be a mix of participants, some who are there more than once, some are there only once. So then we basically have to pick the observation that we are really going for, whether we're just looking at like the OR turnaround time or specific tasks by different people. And that's where my question was, how do you account for the mix?
Well, I think you have to decide if it's important to know who the individuals are. And it's interesting, as I was preparing for this, one of the references said you want to have the groups be as diverse as possible, because then you get the best representation. And another reference said you want to have the groups be as similar as possible, so you can really pick out the differences. So I think it depends on what question you're asking. But if you're asking, is our process overall, is our educational curriculum overall making this process occur more rapidly or with fewer errors, or whatever your criteria is?
Right.
Then you don't necessarily need to track it by the individual participants.
Yeah. So, I was just thinking out, just maybe you can give some advice. We have 2 children's hospitals, and one of our children's hospital is kind of scaling down some of the services because of all the volume issues with the COVID. So one of our PICUs is going to close. So from that ER, critical patients would need to be transferred to the other children's hospital PICU. And we were trying to, so we will be doing some, inside to team simulations to kind of look at that we are, covering all our latent threats and making that process as seamless as possible. So I was just trying to figure out what kind of the run chart would work the best. It's similar to like how you were doing the OR turnaround. So that would be, it would have, efficiencies looking at the team as well as the process. Every person is doing their piece, whether it's the respiratory therapist or the critical care nurse and the transport unit, and looking at the timeliness also. So It has both components.
And that's what in this example, we looked at both defects and defectives, and you could look at defects could be latent safety threats that you identify. They're not really defects, they're latent, but the idea is, how many hazards are there that you can identify. But you could look at successes too, which is, what would your successes be? Maybe decreasing the time. Maybe it's how many transfers happen in less than X number of minutes. You have a goal of getting them over there in
30 minutes is our goal, yeah.
Yeah, so how many times do you achieve that and how many times do you not? But then it's also understanding what, it doesn't tell you why, it just tells you here's a signal.
Right, okay. Maybe I'll email you and discuss further.
Yeah, no, it's interesting.
Yeah.
I'll be happy to try to help.
Yeah, thanks.
It sounds like that would be a great project to do because it's something that you could probably simulate more frequently than might actually happen in real life. So you might be able to get more values on your points if you kind of use your simulated experiences for your time markers. It's kind of like ECPR. It happens relatively rarely, and we all try and decrease our time to get a patient on ECMO during ECPR. But the more sims you do, the more likelihood you will be to figure out what your timing actually is and things you do to might impact it, to add that in there also.
Yes, for sure.
And there are ways to look at rare events, but they're slow. Like one way is to look at the number of days between rare events, but obviously that's a slow process if rare events are thankfully rare. Yeah, I mean, with simulation, we have the great advantage that we can conduct simulations at our relative convenience.
Other questions, thoughts, comments from the audience? Okay.
Well, let me put in a quick plug, or maybe you were going to do this, I don't know, for the IPSS Spring Symposium.
Yeah, great. Everyone, please register and attend. It sounds like it'll be a great experience. So again, thanks everyone for participating in this webinar. Shortly, you will receive an email from IPSS that includes a link to an evaluation, and please take a few minutes to access it and provide your feedback on today's session. The recording of today's webinar, along with the handouts discussed, will be posted on the members only IPSS website in the near future. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Ellen.